this video, I'm going to be talking to you about subject access requests, which you'll often see referred to as SARs. Under the GDPR, this is the right of access, and what that means is that an individual has made a request for their personal information. Or in the context of schools, you might find that a parent or guardian has made a request for the personal information relating to their child. And what we first need to be able to do is identify when a SAR has been made. A SAR can be made verbally or in writing, so don't always expect to receive a nicely drafted email or handwritten letter addressed to the school. We then need to communicate with the requester. So when a request is received into the school, we need to respond, acknowledge the request, and confirm that it will be dealt with under the GDPR. At this stage, it might also be necessary to seek clarification. And that might be the case if there are hundreds of documents that could be disclosable, or if you're just not quite sure what's being asked for. It also might be necessary to seek consent of the data subject, and that might be the case if a request is made for a child's information, that child is over the age of 13 and is capable of giving consent. If that is the case, then the child needs to consent to the release of their data before it is provided to the parent. In both cases of seeking clarification and consent, we need to do it as soon as possible so as not to delay any deadlines. And that brings me on to time limits. So on the face of it, we have a whole calendar month to respond to SARs. That being said, we do need to respond as soon as possible. So for example, if you receive a SAR request on the 2nd of the month, the deadline to respond will be the 2nd of the following month. In a case where clarification was requested, that pauses the time limit. So if you receive a request on the 2nd of the month and you receive that clarification on the 4th of the month, then you can extend the deadline by a further 2 days. In the case of seeking consent, that totally stops the time limit until the point that consent is received. So if you receive a request on the 2nd and the consent is not received until the 6th, the deadline to respond will be the 6th of the following month. Now you might be asking what happens if the 6th of the following month falls on a bank holiday or a weekend. Well, in that case, the deadline to respond will fall to the next working day. And it's worth mentioning at this stage that the GDPR does not take into account the school holidays. So if you receive a request at the start of the 6-week summer holidays, you will still need to respond within the first 1 month. With all that being said, it might be possible to extend the deadline by a further 2 months. And that's in cases where the request is particularly complex. Complexity is not assessed by volume of documents alone, but you will have to assess other factors. So for example, do you have to search through hard copy files that might be stored in the archives? Do you have to search through different hard drives or different servers that contain different types of information? Will third-party information be recorded in the other information? If the answer to all or most of that is yes, then it might be possible to extend the deadline, but do seek advice from your data protection officer before doing so. The next stage of responding to a SAR is to search for the information. So go back to what has been requested, collect that information and gather it all into a pile. The next stage will then be to review the information for the purpose of assessing whether it's disclosable. Under the Data Protection Act 2018, there are certain exemptions that might apply to some information. For example, confidential employment references might not be disclosable, and exam results that haven't yet been released might not be disclosable. But always seek advice from your data protection officer before applying an exemption. You will also need to assess the information to see if it contains any third-party information. If it does, that third-party information needs to be removed. And what I mean by that is if the data subject is called Sam, and within that information there's also information relating to a colleague or another pupil called John, then all of John's information needs to be removed. And that's because it's John's personal information that Sam or his parents are not entitled to receive. So once all of the information has been gathered, reviewed and redacted, we go back to responding to the requester. And that will involve providing a copy of all of the reviewed and redacted information and providing a cover letter, which will include supplementary information. Now that supplementary information will be covered in your privacy notice and will include things like what information is gathered, how is that information gathered, and why is that information gathered.